In this lecture, we are going to go into our first hands-on and we're going to create a DynamoDB table. So here I'm in the DynamoDB console, and creating a DynamoDB table is pretty straightforward. Simply click on this create table button and it will take you to a wizard where you can create a new DynamoDB table. There are only two things that are important here: the table name and a primary key. But as I mentioned in the last lecture, that the access patterns must be known before you create your DynamoDB tables. So we have to take a look at the access patterns that our database table is going to use before we can decide which attributes or which fields to create our primary keys as well as our indexes on. So let's say we have a requirement to store player data for different games, for example, some online games. So we have different players playing different game sessions, and for each player, we want to store the games that they have played along with, let's say, the time at which the game was played, the outcome of the game, whether it was won or it was lost, the score, the game duration, and so on. So our first requirement is to store the data. So we should be able to retrieve the gameplay data of a particular player as well as the historical data of that player. So all the games that this player has played in the past, we should be able to retrieve it. So that's our first requirement. And second access pattern that we have is, let's say we want to create a gaming leaderboard. So we should be able to get the top scores of any particular game and display it in real time. So these are the two access patterns. The first, to store and retrieve the game data for a particular player, and second, to get the gaming leaderboard for a particular game. In relational databases, we have rows and columns, while in DynamoDB, we have items and attributes. So an item is a record and attributes are like the fields or the columns. Okay, so here we can have attributes like, say, user ID to designate the ID of the player, game ID to designate the game session that's being played. We can have the game timestamp, we can have result, score, duration of the game, and so on. But as you can see here, we have only two input boxes here: table name and primary key. So as you know, DynamoDB is a non-relational database and it supports variable data structures. So all any item needs is a primary key and rest of the attributes are optional. So we only provide a table name and a primary key when we create a DynamoDB table. So let's say gameplay, let's say we call it gameplay, and for the partition key, we can say user ID as the partition key, and we can also have a sort key. Let's say game ID. So here we have a partition key and a sort key. So partition key is how the data is partitioned in the table, and game ID is the sort key, so it designates how the data is sorted for each partition key. So for each user, we can sort the data by the games that the player has played, right? So this is our primary index or primary key, and this is going to serve as our first access pattern. So it will allow us to get the game scores of any particular user, and it will also allow us to get the historical list of games played by a particular user. So that's our primary key. Now I'm going to untick this default settings, so it will open up all different configurations that we can set here. So the second access pattern we have is to create a gaming leaderboard. So we want to get the top scores of a particular game. So we can create an index on the game ID, and of course we'll have to sort it by the score of a particular game. So let's create an index here. This will be a secondary index. In this case, the partition key can be game ID. So we can get information about a particular game, and we want it to be sorted by, let's say, score. Right, so this is going to be an index, and this will be a global secondary index. There are two types of indexes: local secondary index and global secondary index. And we'll come to that in a bit. For now, just know that we're creating this index to help us retrieve the top scores data for a particular game. So we simply add an index, and you can see that its type is GSI, which is global secondary index, right? And then we have a read-write capacity mode. There are two modes: provisioned capacity that allows us to use free tier as well, and then there is an on-demand mode. And we'll come to that in a bit. We can just remove auto scaling. We don't need that. And I'll just set this to 1 capacity units, okay? So we have the minimal estimated cost. This shows us the estimated cost, but if you don't have any other tables in your account, this will be in free tier in most probability. All right, and we can keep rest of the settings as they are and simply hit create. So this will create our first DynamoDB table. We have a couple of tables that I use for other courses. You can ignore that. So now you can see that our table has been created. So that's how easy it is to create a DynamoDB table. So you can see different characteristics of the table here: the table name, the primary partition key and primary sort key. We also have the capacity units that decides the pricing and other information. And here we have the ARN of the table, which is a unique identifier of the table. On the items tab, we can see the items of the table. So from here, you can add or remove or view items. So let's create an item quickly. So here you can say, let's say user 1, and we can say game 1, and the score, let's say 98. All right, so this is a quick way, and you can add more attribute to it. For example, you can add result, which is not a mandatory attribute, and I can say win, right? And we save, and we can similarly create another item. So user 2, game 1, and score could be 50, and let's say I don't want to add a result here, so we can still do that, and we save. This particular item does not have the result attribute, so this is variable data structures. Let's say I want to edit this item here, and you can see tree mode. You can change the mode to text, and you can see that it's simply a JSON format. All right, so data is actually stored in JSON format. And here we have 3 attributes, and if we go to the first one and switch to edit mode, you can see that this JSON has 4 attributes. This is a simple JSON view, and if you click on DynamoDB JSON, it will show you the structure as it is stored internally in DynamoDB table. So we have attribute game ID, its data type, which is string, and its value, which is game 1, and so on and so forth. So this is how information is stored in DynamoDB table. All right, then here on the metrics tab, you can see CloudWatch metrics of the table. On the alarms tab, you can create different alarms. You can see some alarms have been created by default. Here you can set the capacity of the table, and we'll discuss that later in the course. Here you can add or delete indexes. Then this is global table. So if you want to create a multi-region, multi-master table, then you can enable it here. From here, you can create or restore your backups or do your point-in-time recovery. Again, we'll come to it later in the course. Then we have contributor insights. This is a diagnostic tool integrated with CloudWatch. Then here we have triggers that allow you to run different Lambda functions based on certain events. Right, and here access control, you can use this for creating your fine-grained access control policies. Again, we'll come to it later in the course. And tags are typical of all different AWS services. You use them to segregate your resources, typically for billing purposes. So that's a quick overview of the DynamoDB console. Let's continue to the next lecture.